Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay. I'm here to talk about the new Amazon Prime movie that is starring Nicole Kidman and Javier Bardem, produced by Aaron Sorkin, called Being the Ricardos, about a week in the life of Lucille Ball, aka Lucy Arnaz, and her husband, Desi Arnaz, the duo behind the famous 1950s TV show I Love Lucy. Now, what this movie was not what I expected at all. When I first heard about this project initially, when Kate Blanchett was the star of it, I thought it was going to be about the life of um, Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz. It wasn't about their life at all. It was about a particular time, a very obscure time in the life of Lucille Ball when she was accused of being a communist or voting, sympathizing with the Communist Party. Now, keep in mind, this was the 1950s, the Red Scare era, the era when the Republican Party and the senator in Wisconsin, Joseph McCarthy, thought everybody was a communist. There was public trials of individuals in Hollywood that Walt Disney was a part of, that Ronald Reagan was a part of, in witch hunting, if you will, red sympathizers and sympathizers of communism. And Lucille Ball was one of them, partially because her grandfather was involved with the labor movement in the 1930s. And of course, the labor movement in the 1930s, yeah, Nicole Kidman. It was initially Kate Blanchett, Lisa, but um, in the 30s was involved with socialism and communism, and um, Lucy's grandfather was involved with that. But in the movie, we find out later that scandal was something that Lucy herself put out. Lucy herself leaked that to the media to make it a smokescreen scandal. The media herself never accused her of being a communist, as Ricky Ricardo or Desi Arnaz, her husband, says. In the movie, the only thing right about Lucy was her hair, and that's not even real. But, okay, the question comes, why would she leak that out to the papers? Well, it was to divert attention from the real scandal. And the real scandal about um, her and Desi Arnaz, was that Desi Arnaz was actually a womanizer, a serial cheater. And the movie does portray him as a serial cheater. He cheated on Lucy several times in their marriage, and it was well known that their marriage was very tumultuous. They really didn't get along behind the scenes. There was a lot of power struggles between them. Um, what I didn't like about this portrayal, and I felt was kind of racist, was people in the movie kept saying, well, of course he's going to cheat. Of course he's going to be a womanizer. He's Cuban. That's in the Cuban culture. You know, they don't stay faithful to one woman. I thought this was kind of, I don't know, like, could you imagine if they'd have said this? I mean, I know it was the 50s, and, this was the attitude, this was the prevailing attitude of people in the 50s, the racist attitude, especially back then. And that's what made the communist thing so insidious, because Desi Arnaz himself came from a communist country, was chased out of Cuba by communists when they took over, or when they took power in 1959. So, like Lisa's saying, think of the time it was said in, yes. But it just seems so weird and so funny in a way, funny in a bad way, for them to just be saying that all the time. Like, well, of course he's a cheater. He's Cuban. I mean, look at how they define manhood. But it does go into, which was something as myself, not a big fan of I Love Lucy, not a huge fan of I Love Lucy, but I did know going in a little about them and a little about their history and their background. And it is true that Desi Arnaz did kind of feel some type of way about Lucy's fame. Keep in mind that Desi Arnaz himself was came to America first, and he himself was a celebrity. He himself was a singer, but he never made it as a singer. His fame was being attached. His He was only famous in the minds of other people because um he was the husband of Lucille Ball, or the husband of Lucille Ball. In fact, she always went by Lucille Ball in the public eye, even when she was married to him. He says, bring up a great point. I wasn't born in the 50s, but this show is a part of American history. This show is a part of television history because this was the first television show that was popular with everyone in the country. Prior to this, television had been a lot of people didn't have TVs. Television was something new. It was invented in the 1940s, and not a lot of people had TVs in 1953, but those that did have TVs in the 50s watched this show. This was a cultural phenomenon. In a similar way, if I wanted to compare it to something modern, be like Game of Thrones, but even bigger than Game of Thrones, because Game of Thrones, not everybody has HBO, but everybody had CBS at the time. So the people that had TVs all watched the show. And it was groundbreaking in that it was the first show to have a female lead. It was the first show to show the females could be funny, and as Lisa is already bringing up, it was groundbreaking in the fact that it was the first time ever that a Hispanic man and a white woman were on TV together. And this is something that the producers did not want, and they show this in the movie. They say in the movie, the quoted line, well, why would an all American girl like Lucy be with well, a Spanish guy or a Mexican, as they phrase it? And she has to come out and she has to say, well, he's not Mexican, he's not Spanish, he speaks Spanish, but he's never been to Spain. He is Cuban American, he is proud of his Cuban American roots. And I had to think that part of the communist hysteria that they were feeding into, other than Lucy making it up. But they were feeding into it partially because of the politics and because he was Cuban. If he was not Cuban, I don't think that they would have fed into so much of the communist hysteria, the Red Scare hysteria, or the red baiting. Because he was Cuban, it fed into that. It fed into that environment, that stereotype. And not only was he Cuban, but he was a Cuban musical player. He played the congos and he played mambo music. And mambo music in the 1940s and early 50s was some of the most popular music in the country. It was like a craze. It was like reggaeton was in the 2000s, in the early 2000s. Even people that didn't know Spanish and that were not Cuban were fans of mambo music. In fact, a lot of American people were called mambo nicks and fans of mambo music. We saw this in Dirty Dancing. Latin music was everywhere in the time of this show, the late 40s and early 50s, because a lot of people traveled to Cuba. All kinds of Americans would travel to Cuba and vacation in Cuba before the revolution, not just gangsters, but everyday people would travel to Cuba. So it was a craze. It was partially inspired by this show. They were hearing it on the show and they were liking it, and mambo became all the rage for a while until rock and roll uh, appeared on the scene in the late 50s. Yeah, yeah, Lisa, he did. He came over here in 1951. Um, he didn't escape Castro. He was escaping, I think, Batista, the previous Cuban dictator that was there before Batista. So it was before the revolution, or at the time that the revolution was happening, because he mentions in the movie that the communists took away his house. The Bolsheviks took away his house in Cuba. He was from an upper class family in Cuba, and they took away his home. So it was interesting that he and Lucy were kind of opposites in their political persuasion. Because her family, being that they were white and working class, of course they sympathized with the left and with labor movements of the 30s and 40s. But of course, Desi Arnaz, being that he actually experienced what labor movements and leftism to the extreme could become, he was not for that, and he was purely capitalist, like most Cuban Cuban Americans were and are. Most Cuban Americans um, democratic or not democratic, capitalist and purely business minded. And that's how Desi Arnaz thought of things. And Lucille Ball, being a product of her time and product of her upbringing and her culture in the Midwest, she thought completely different. Yeah, Republicans. Lisa, but at that time, they were more likely to be Democratic because that was before Kennedy botched the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. So at this time in the early 1950s, they were more likely to be Democratic, and the Democratic Party during this time was a lot different, as we spoke about in other videos, than it is today. It was more right wing. There was two different factions of the Democratic Party, the Dixiecrats in the South and the Liberal Party and the Liberal Democrats in the North. But once Kennedy botched the Cuban Missile Crisis and he was failed to overthrow Fidel Castro, most Cuban Americans, Cuban people switched to the Republican Party, and most of them are Republicans to this day. I think with Desi Arnaz would be more, if he was alive, he would be more, he would be more Republican, because that was his business. That was his business mindset, his business acumen. He and Lucille Ball started their own film production company at a time when actors did not um, did not um, start their own production companies. They were at the mercy of the television companies that were all originally radio companies in the 1930s and 40s, but they became music. They became television companies. What did I think of the acting in the movie? I thought the guy who stole the show was the man who played um, William Farley's character. On the television show, there was a couple. Besides Lucy and Ricky, there were a couple next door, Fred and Ethel. And the guy who played Fred was William Farley, and he in the movie is played by J.K. Simmons. And I thought J.K. Simmons had some of the funniest lines, some of the some of the funniest parts of the movie that you'll see is played by J.K. Simmons. Of course, J.K. Simmons, he kills every role that he plays in, from a racist on Oz um, to Spider-Man, to every role he's in. He's a great actor. Um, as far as the ones who play Lucy and Ricky, uh, Nicole Kidman, she was all right, but they didn't really look like Lucy and Ricky. What I know of Lucy and Ricky from the days that I would watch the reruns of that show. But Lisa is saying I wouldn't find this show funny because it was not. I wasn't born at that time. That's not true, because I always found the Honeymooners, which is another show like around the same time period, to be funny. And yeah, Javier Bardem, yeah. But yeah, I've seen better portrayals of Desi Arnaz, and there's only one other portrayal I've seen of Desi Arnaz. But I thought it could have been better, honestly. Lisa, um, like I said, the saving grace of the movie, performance wise, is J.K. Simmons, who played William Farley. They don't mention the famous Vitamin Vegemin episode that everyone knows. If you don't even know anything about the I Love Lucy show, people know the Vitamin Vegemin episode where Lucy gets drunk and she has to repeat the name of that tonic, and it's the Vitamin Vegemin thing. They do mention the famous grape episode. There's an episode of I Love Lucy where her and Lucy and uh, Lucy, Ricky, and Ethel and Fred go to Italy, and Ethel and Fred always. Ethel and Fred. Lucy and Ethel are crushing the grapes. That's a. They show that one, and the thing they bring up that a lot of people know, television historians and a lot of other people that are that are into television history know, is that when Lucy became pregnant in real life, they didn't want to show this on TV. They wanted to hide it because they felt that it would not be appropriate. It would allude to sex. So they wanted it was a very prudent era, a very conservative era. So they didn't want to talk about it on TV. So they wanted her to, like, every time she would go in a certain scene, she would hide behind a table or hide behind a chair, and they wouldn't talk about the pregnancy publicly. Well, Lucy and Desi was not having that. They were like, she's pregnant in real life. We're going to talk about the pregnancy, and we're going to have the baby, little Ricky, on the show, the real life baby, and the real life son, little Ricky, on the show. And it became the highest rated television show in the history of all television. They made the right decision. They broke the taboo and they broke the mold. Oftentimes, these critics and these people on TV, they're wrong. They say you shouldn't talk about this, you shouldn't talk about that, it wouldn't be right to talk about this, and it wouldn't be right to talk about that. And people go ahead and they do it anyway and they get high ratings. So what? Taboos and rules are meant to be broken, right? And Desi and Lucy knew that, and they wasn't trying to have themselves be constrained. Right? Lisa's absolutely right. They stopped doing that. Um, but as you recall, in the 50s, all couples on TV slept in separate beds. They didn't even want to act like sex was even a thing. And Lucy says this in the movie. She says, "Yes, I'm 14 weeks pregnant. That means 14 weeks ago, I fucked my husband." You know what I mean? So she just kept it real. She kept it 100 with the producers. And she said, "Look, we're not going to pretend like sex is not a thing." It was a really weird era in the 50s. It was sort of like being in a culture like Pakistan or a culture like Afghanistan or one of those really conservative type cultures where they don't talk about sex or where they don't talk about real life shit. You know, like as Lisa said, in the 90s, they let everything slide. By the 1990s, they let it all slide. They let it all hang out. The children, they don't really show in the movie. Lisa, by the time the movie ends, it's when the episode where they have little Ricky, and that's it. It's only about a specific time frame in the life of the Ricardos. It's not about the Ricardos necessarily their whole life. It's about a specific time frame in 1953 when Lucy got pregnant, when she was accused of being a communist, and the events in that era. They don't really show the kids. The reason why the kids are trending, Lucy and Desi Jr., why they're trending online, is because they don't really agree with the portrayal of their father in the movie. The father is portrayed, like I said, like a womanizer, like he didn't love the mother. All he did was cheat, and it was because of his race, because of his ethnicity, and of course, as kids, being that there's kids, they see it differently. They don't see their father in that way. Sure, the father and the mother had issues, but they saw the love and the partnership of Desi and Lucy. And we know from studying the life of Desi and Lucy that once they became divorced, They were better as friends and business partners and co-parents in the Desilu studios than they were as husband and wife. They had a chemistry that was unique to them. You know what I mean? And Desi was the brains behind it, and Lucy was the personality. Lucy and Desi Arnaz, Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz, they changed the history of television. The reason why television is produced in front of a studio audience today, they don't really show this in the movie, but this is a reality. The reason why it's produced in front of a studio audience today, well, not really today, but sitcoms in general. Sitcoms from that point on until like the 90s were produced in front of a studio audience because of Lucille Ball. Lucille Ball had her roots in vaudeville. She was used to performing in front of an audience and feeding off the energy of that audience. So Desi Arnaz said, you're going to have a studio audience in the studio in front of her, and she's going to feed off that studio audience. And that's how the modern sitcom was born. Before that, the sitcoms before that, they were produced on a separate sound stage with no audience. And the laugh track was artificial. Kind of like the sitcoms are today. You don't really see laugh track sitcoms today or sitcoms with a studio audience today. Today, it's more like shows like The Office, shows like Modern Family, shows like Malcolm in the Middle, shows like Everybody Hates Chris with no audience. Right? Most of the sitcoms today are kind of like that. It's changed, but since the 50s until like the 90s, it was always like that, and that was because of Desi Arnaz and Lucille Ball. They they started that. They revolutionized that, and was to fit to her style. When you see female comedians, when you saw well, you didn't see female comedians before the 1950s. All actresses, most actresses were like the Judy Garlands of the world, the the starlets. You know what I mean. The beautiful Hollywood starlets. You didn't see any really female comedians that much. Female um, actresses really didn't get physical. They didn't do really physical comedy. But Lucille Ball did. Lucille Ball was not afraid to act silly, act a little stupid, a little childish for the camera and do a lot of physical comedy. She is really the mother of all mainstream comedians on television. Before her, they wasn't really doing that, and it was like, okay, you're a female, you can't be funny, right? You have to be like again, like a Judy Garland, like a Greta Garbo, all these Jean Harlow, all these old 1930s and 1920s and 1930s type actresses. What she was at first, she was that, but she really found her niche in comedy and in vaudeville and in live performances, and that was where she excelled, and that was where Desi Arnaz excelled too, because once Mambo fell out of favor and people weren't really listening to Cuban music really that much anymore, and he wasn't really doing tours, the way he got his music out there was through the show, and he found his niche in the show. They were the ones that really made television popular like that. Before that, television was just like junk TV. You know what I mean? Like I said, old radio shows like the Goldbergs, the original Goldbergs, not the one on TV now. Amos and Andy, um, wrestling, which again, like I said, was popular in the 40s and early 50s. But no sitcoms, no original sitcoms that weren't already on radio until she came out. And she came out and she changed the game and she revolutionized the medium of the sitcom. And the medium of the sitcom was the most popular medium on television until like the modern era. The sitcom now is not really that popular. There are sitcoms. We've done reviews on this channel, Mixish, The Goldbergs, old school sitcoms. But before her, uh, was no sitcoms. You know, what did I give the movie? Excuse me, Lisa. I gave the movie uh, 3 out of 4 stars. It was a pretty, like I said, a couple of lines just made me laugh out loud that J.K. Simmons said uh, again. But the fact that they harped on his Cuban heritage and they said that, oh, well, he cheated because he's Cuban. I know it was a timepiece and it was, fitting for the time that they portrayed the 50s as, super racist. And we know that was a reality, back then. But, like, still, like, that's the reason you give why he's cheating on his wife because he's Cuban. No, I think his deeper reason was that he was just insecure. You know what I mean? He was the celebrity at one time, and she was the background. She was the girl dancing, right, and performing, and he was the celebrity. And then when she became the celebrity, and she became it's good. And Lisa and I can make this comparison. It's sort of like Beyonce and Jay-Z. When she became the celebrity, when she's the more famous one, she's the more popular one, and he's the man. He's supposed to be this macho. He's supposed to be the star. He's supposed to be the big music celebrity. But yet, the wife is way more famous than the man if he's into his insecurity. So it's like, yeah, maybe you are more famous to the people, but I'm still gonna do what I'm gonna do, and I'm gonna still cheat on you. You know what I mean? Because I'm still a man. You know what I mean? But nobody would say, "Oh, well, they're just doing that because that's just an ethnicity. That's just a thing." You know what I mean? That if the woman is more famous, some odd time the man feels some type of way, and that was the thing with Desi Arnaz and Lucille Ball. You know what I mean? It was. I think it was a thing even with. It was a thing with a lot of celebrities. When the woman is more famous than the man gonna feel some type of way that it's an attack on his masculinity. You know what I mean? So that was a deeper reason, and they didn't really. I saw it in. There's another movie that came out years ago that it was made for TV that was called Lucy that really explored that. You know what I mean? And that thing, the reason for Desi infidelity. This movie doesn't really explore it. This movie just cops in, oh well, he's Cuban, and that's just how Cuban men are. You know what I mean? And that's not true. That's for any ethnicity of man. I just think some men feel some type of way that the woman is more famous, that they're sitting out there calling him, Mr. Lucille Ball instead of her as Lucy Arnaz. She never used his name. She was famous in her own right. She was strong willed. She was assertive. And again, like Beyonce and Jay, he's just music. And we spoke about this with the Drake stuff. It's like, okay, yeah, music is one thing. He was just music. Music is one thing. But when you're on television and you're a star, um, that's different. You know what I mean? That's a whole nother level. Television or a whole nother television and movies is a whole nother level than music. Because music, you're only going to reach a number of people. You're not going to reach the masses. Because what if they don't listen to that type of music? What if they don't listen to rap or mambo in the case of Desi Arnaz? They wouldn't know who he is, but everybody would know who Lucy is. you know, you know what I mean. So that's that's more of why I think he cheated, from a man's point of view and a man's perspective. Another thing that it talks about that other, I give it credit on this though. It does discuss the woman who played Ethel Mertz, Vivian Vance, and her eating disorder. Vivian Vance, um, she was, for the time period anyway, she was heavy. And there's a scene in there where she's working out, and one of the ladies, one of the script writers, tells her, "Listen, why don't you eat breakfast? Why don't you eat potatoes, bacon, eggs, and stuff?" And she's like, "Well, I'm on a diet." Lucy gets her and Lucy then discuss and have a conflict, and Lucy tells her, "Listen, one of the reasons why people like you is because they see themselves in you. They see you as a normal shaped woman, that looks like the average everyday American woman. So don't lose weight and don't become so self-obsessed that you get yourself sick." And I didn't even know about Vivian Vance's um eating disorder. So that was one of the things I always look for, guys, in movies and stuff like that. And I watch documentaries and stuff, things that I could learn from it, things that I could exclaim from it. And that was one of the things that I learned that I did not know. I I know virtually nothing or knew before watching the movie about Vivian Vance or William Frawley. A lot of people, of course, they focus on Lucy and Desi as the stars of it, and other movies and other forms of media focused on that. You know what I mean? But learning about Vivian Vance's eating disorder, wow, that blew me away. So I give it credit on that. I take points away again for the Cuban thing. Just felt like that was unnecessary. I guess to show the racism of the time, but they could have talked about male female issues and how some guys who are famous might feel some type of way about their wife being more famous than them in celebrity type relationships. And nowadays on late shows, and even back then probably even more so, they would they would probably talk. Late night talk show hosts like Johnny Carson or Jack Parr in those days would joke probably around, "Oh, you know, when y'all go out, what do you hold her purse?" You know what I mean? Like, and he'll feel like, "Damn, I'm second class. I'm emasculated." So they could have attributed to the reason why he was doing what he was doing. You know what I mean? Rather than his ethnicity or his race. You know, the political side. Yeah, that was kind of cool. But I knew about that story, about her being a communist and stuff, because my social studies teacher in 11th grade, Mr. Briganti, um, told that story. How they thought Lucy was a communist. I knew they thought other celebrities were communists, um, members of the Communist Party as well, and they got blacklisted. But her, they used humor and they used, her wit. They wanted to hate her after that, but they couldn't because she was just so good. You know what I mean? She was just so funny. Um, it wasn't what I expected. I thought it was going to be like, about their whole lives, but it was just that little time frame, uh, in in the history of their life. So overall, Lisa, I give it, 3 out of 4. I take away points only for the Cuban thing, but I get and I understand why the kids would dislike it because it doesn't really tell a fleshed out story of how they related to each other. Their relationship was a toxic relationship. You know what I mean? But it was a unique relationship because only Desi understood Lucy and only Lucy understood Desi. You know what I mean? They couldn't be together because they were too toxic for one another and they would always fight and shit. But they could be together in a business sense. You know what I mean? They pushed each other in a business way, sort of like a Bill and Hillary or a Jay Z and Beyonce. As business partners and business associates, they were good, but personally, nah, they were not so good because of Desi's wandering eye and because of Lucy's assertiveness and Lucy's strong headedness. I'm not sure what sign really Lucy was. Let me look that up. It'd be funny if she was a Virgo. She was the Beyonce of her day, right? Okay, no. Uh, yeah, she was a Leo. So yeah, that's kind of just as bad. You know what I mean? So they were butting heads, those two. But I wish the movie had gone a little bit more into that rather than what it what it attributed. But other than that, it was a pretty good movie. Um, like I said, they originally wanted Kate Blanchett to play it, but Nicole Kidman, even though she didn't look like Lucy, um, she she herself she herself was in a toxic public relationship similar to that with Tom Cruise. So I think Nicole Kidman kind of fed off of kind of fed into her real life. Okay, yeah. Kind of, Lisa said that Desi Arnaz was a Pisces. Lisa, I mean, Lisa. Nicole Kidman kind of fed into um Lucille Ball's experience because her experience was similar with her and Tom Cruise. Her and Tom Cruise, they were together and then they weren't together and they were together and they weren't together and then they did Eyes Wide Shut, whatever, whatever that was, crazy movie. But they worked good, Nicole Kidman and Tom Cruise, as a team. But In the public eye, there was some toxic shit. Just kind of like, again, like Desi and Lucy. Desi and Lucy were kind of like the first power couple, really, of the entertainment world. People say, well, Joe DiMaggio, Marilyn Monroe, but a lot of people didn't know about Joe DiMaggio with Marilyn Monroe. I say Desi and Lucy were the first, the OG Beyonce and Jay Z, or Cardi B and Offset of their day. Toxic publicly, but behind the scenes work pretty good and work together, business minded as partners. But yeah, that's what I thought of it. It was a pretty good movie. I think it's worth a checking out. On, again, for J.K. Simmons' portrayal and the information that you will learn about Desi and Lucy, and also um, um, uh, yeah, about the time period, about the Red Scare. If you don't know any really thing about the Red Scare, um, I always like to tie kind of things that I talk about into a larger social context. So more than just learning about them, learning about the impact that they had on the entertainment world and about the political climate of the day, the Red Scare kind of anti-communist hysteria that was going on at the time. As a historical piece. So, like Lisa said, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the bell button to see when my next video is coming out. Thank you guys for contributing. Love y'all. Peace. And Lisa, thanks for being a part of the video.